You are listening to the Norton Library Podcast, where we explore classic works of literature and philosophy with the leading scholars of the Norton Library, a new series from W. Norton that introduces influential texts to a new generation of readers. I'm your host, Mark Chirino, with Michael Von Cannon producing. Today, we present the second of our 2 episodes devoted to Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, as we interview its editor, Kenneth W. Warren. In part 1, we discussed Sinclair's politics and his art, the power of this novel and how it inspired reforms to U.S. law. In this second episode, we learn more about Kenneth Warren's history with this work, his favorite line from the novel, the challenge the novel poses new readers, and we discuss the relationship between propaganda and art. Kenneth W. Warren is Fairfax M. Cone Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of English at the University of Chicago. He is the author of What Was African American Literature? So Black and Blue, Ralph Ellison and the Occasion of Criticism, and Black and White Strangers, Race and American Literary Realism. Kenneth Warren, welcome back to the Norton Library Podcast.
Hi, Mark. It's really good to see you again.
Good to see you again, and I really look forward to exploring more aspects of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. The first thing I want to get you to comment on is your edition and its really striking color scheme. Do you have any reaction to what the geniuses at the Norton Library did with your book cover?
Yeah, thank you for that. And thanking you, I'm taking credit for something that really is the work and the insight of other people. I mean, among the things about the Norton editions is that they convey across a variety of titles and authors a sense of this edition as a singular thing. And yet, through what seems to me to be a kind of a remarkable understanding of what color can do, they're actually able to give you a sense of the content of the book through color and contrast. And what struck me immediately when I saw the proposed color for this was how perfect it seemed to me to be that the kind of the red, without being garish, conveyed the sort of sanguinary aspect of what the meatpacking industry was. You get a sense, and when you read this book and you open it, that this is exactly the cover that conveys what this book is about.
You described it really well. It's not blood red. It's almost like we have a sienna or a cinnamon of some kind, and it's really almost deeper than blood red. It's like you're in the thick of it. So very powerful cover.
And the other point there being, right, that, and this is crucial for Sinclair, right, to not be sensationalistic by which you're just exaggerating, because the book is not about exaggerating. It's about reality.
Do you remember first encountering The Jungle yourself?
Yeah, actually, it was relatively, whether this counts as early or late, but it was my first year of graduate school when I was reading through what was, we sort of colloquially called sort of a 100-book list, and we had some choice of the books to put on, and the Jungle was one of those that I made sure I hadn't read it but heard about it, and so that's when I came across this. I finished my undergraduate studies, was beginning my work as a aspiring PhD.
Do you think that most first-time readers of The Jungle encounter it in high school, like historically over the 20th century? Was this a typical high school book or mostly college and beyond?
I am somewhat uncertain. I do think that earlier on, many readers encountered it as a high school book. I think increasingly now it's probably something that people read, that young people read in college classes.
Yeah. When you first read it, of your 100 books, did it stand out? Did you have a reaction to it at the time?
Yeah, it did. in part because it was so powerful and so compelling. It actually, at a moment when I'm trying to go quickly through as many books as I can, ended up sort of stopping me in my tracks. You can see in the moment where, Ona is, forced to sort of betray her marriage and things of this sort. These moments are things that you can't just blithely read and just take the notes on and, continue on to the next episode, next chapter, and next book. It brought home to you the reality of, why for why someone like me, why are books important? It's because in many respects, it's because of what they tell us about the world that we are living in.
And how does the jungle relate to your scholarship, and why do you keep returning to it?
I find myself drawn, really, you could say, by the conundrum, or whether it's a conundrum or the challenge that Sinclair described in writing The Jungle. What is the relation of literary form, literary excellence, to material and political history and belief? Are these two things necessarily at odds with one another? And to a certain extent they are. But recognizing that conflict can also provide the basis for producing what makes something an enduring work of art.
Ken, one of the words I think we avoided entirely during the first episode is propaganda. Do you think The Jungle is propaganda?
That's an interesting word in relation to literature. Another writer who was active during this period, W.E.B. Du Bois, who famously wrote The Souls of Black Folk, which came out in 1903, so a few years before The Jungle, wrote later in the 20s in an essay that for him all art is propaganda, and he doesn't give a damn for any piece of art that isn't. But what he meant by that was that in order for art at that moment he felt to be true art, it had to argue for the right of all human beings. And he was speaking specifically of the plight of Black Americans in a highly racist society, to live, to enjoy, and to love. And so to be regarded as fully human. So you could say on that account, one could accept the label of propaganda for The Jungle. But as I said, I don't think that would be something that Sinclair, that would be a distinction that would, well, let's put it, that would be a label that he would like to see attached to The Jungle. He continued to write political articles in political journalism. He clearly knew the difference between what it is to, write just a straightforward political piece and what it is to write a novel. And he felt in many ways that the truth of novelistic art derived from its willingness to embrace issues that truly mattered for, in different ways for certain sets of people. He wrote from the standpoint of a belief in the rightness of the cause of the working class. And for him, that's reality, not propaganda.
Maybe with some of these ideas in mind, what would you expect to be common challenges to first-time readers of this book?
Well, one of the challenges that everybody mentions has to do with when you get towards the end of the book and Sinclair is faced with the reality or the challenge, let's say, of rendering effectively Jurgis's conversion to socialism. And that's the moment where you could say the art of the novel is perhaps under the most extreme challenge by the political commitment of the novel. And some of this is a result of the fact that, novels, as we've been taught to see them, are representations of the beliefs and the, words of other people. They're representations. They're not, simple declarations of those beliefs and principles. And you could say at that moment, it seems as if the novel has sort of left the land of the novel in order to express its true views. And I think a couple of observations might be pertinent to how we evaluate that moment in the novel. And part of what I'm saying here is that I do think our capacity to appreciate what Sinclair was trying to do, or to criticize what he's trying to do, has to depend in some sense on not kind of like a snap judgment that he sort of gets it wrong on the propaganda side of things. And two things are at work here. One, and I, in the introduction, make reference to an observation by Christopher Hitchens about the novel, was that the problem of the novel is not Sinclair's deficiencies as an artist. It's actually his effectiveness as an artist. And we talked last time about how powerful the early chapters are as they focus on the wedding feast and the early challenges of Jurgis and his family. That those are really remarkable chapters in Sinclair's capacity to give us the immediate personal and individual plight of the family, but also to connect that plight with the larger point that he wants to make about capitalism and about the need for socialism. It's done sort of exquisitely well in those early chapters. But the political point that the novel needs to make is that even when you don't have such horrible scenes of exploitation to depict, that capitalism is still doing its dirty work. So that when Jurgis is tramping about and he comes across the harvester plant, which is actually a kind of model of a progressive industry, and it to work there is to be in a world that seems almost 180 degrees opposed to what it is to work in the meatpacking industry. What you need to understand, or what Sinclair wants us to understand, is that even that industry is, at the end of the day, as indifferent to the plight of the worker as the meatpacking industry is, because the moment that there's a crisis of overproduction and they have to shut down the plant, the workers are just simply, cast to the wind. And so the socialist point is that even in those occupations where on a day-to-day basis, life seems pretty good and pretty acceptable, within capitalism, you are always, a moment away from being tossed to the wolves. And that it's hard to actually depict that reality in a way that is as compelling as it is to depict what Jurgis and his family are experiencing over the larger part of the book.
That is such an excellent point, because at the end of the book, as you mentioned, there is literally a lecture. So a sermon about socialism. And it's hard to believe that scene takes place in the same novel that had the immediacy of entering into the factory where you could, you're in the belly of the beast and you can see the blood and gore and smell it. And it's maybe the most descriptive writing you've ever read in your life. And this coexists in the same novel.
Yeah, you're right about the sense of contrast. But the other point that's, I think, crucial for us in thinking about Sinclair, is that Sinclair sincerely believed that the United States at the moment of his writing The Jungle was perhaps maybe one or two election cycles away from electing socialists to lead the government. That is to say, he believed that the reality of the moment, because he felt it was so clear to anyone paying attention. That's why the lecture format has a kind of reality to it, that anyone paying attention could see the unsustainability and the untenability of capitalism. That the working people were waking up to this moment, and were about to actually become what Jurgis is, someone listening to a lecture, and the experience that he has as he's sitting there is a moment of almost religious conversion, as we would say, and that for Sinclair was reality, not for him a kind of utopian dream.
Do you have a favorite line in this novel?
It's hard to say a favorite line as such. I mean, I think, in some sense, I'm just being fairly conventional. There's a passage that occurs in chapter 3 when the family is first viewing the workings of the meat plant. And it's a moment where the novel is sort of moving back and forth, between the reflections of the narrator and the reflections particularly of Jurgis. And, it starts a paragraph starting off in our volume. It's on page 39. It says, one could not stand and watch very long without becoming philosophical, without beginning to deal in symbols and similes and to hear the Hog-Squeal of the universe. Was it permitted to believe that there was nowhere upon earth or above earth a heaven for hogs, where they were requited for all this suffering? Each one of these hogs was a separate creature. Some were white hogs, some were black, some were brown, some were spotted, some were old, some were young, some were long and lean, some were monstrous, and each of them had an individuality of his own, a will of his own, a hope and a heart's desire. Each was full of self-confidence, of self-importance, and a sense of dignity. And then that paragraph goes on with Jurgis at the end of it saying, my God, I'm glad I'm not a hog. And the power of this is something that the novel comes back to at the end, where Jurgis recalls that moment and realizing that, actually, those hogs were me.
That's mighty. That's such a great one. When you introduce this to students, do you tend to teach this historically or to talk about its literary merit? What are your techniques that you have found to be successful?
Well, I hope it's not a dodge to say I try to do a little bit of both. I typically, let's say I regularly teach a course on the Gilded Age America. So that the period from after the Civil War, that in our first conversation I made reference to as part of the world that Upton Sinclair grew up in. And so I include novels like Mark Twain's and Charles Dudley Warner's book called The Gilded Age, which gave the period its name. And so I try to do two things. One, which is to show how during this moment, the desire of a lot of American novelists to produce fictions that were realistic to the society that they were living in required, in some sense, that they try to come to terms with the fantastic power that accumulated wealth and the expansion of industry was exerting over American society. But at the same time, we're also trying to make a claim for the distinctiveness and the singularity of novel writing and literary writing at this moment, that it was something to be valued on its own terms, and that it could not simply be valued for its capacity to make a political statement, but rather for what it could show were the capacities of novel writing for understanding the human condition. Mm-hmm. So I try to set up that dynamic as a way of thinking about this novel.
Do you have a hot take about Upton Sinclair or the jungle? Can you say something controversial for us?
Well, I feel it's hard for me to say something controversial because, in some ways, I was thinking about something I think we'll talk about momentarily, which is the jungle for the present moment, and that the hot take would be the jungle is as relevant today as it ever was. We're not looking, even though we are living in some sense in a world in which some of the things we can take for advantage. I mean, for the most part, we feel we can go into a supermarket and buy, whether it's meat or vegetables or whatever, and have some reasonable expectation that we won't get sick or die. We have the jungle to thank for that. The 1906 Act was really the beginning of a series of government actions to improve the safety and the quality of the foodstuffs that we eat. And so even if a plant here or there fails to keep up its standards, we do have mechanisms to come in and then, close down those plants and the like. But as we saw recently with the shutting down of the Boar's Head plant in Virginia, as it was tied to listeria deaths, and we read those articles and you see the descriptions of what was going on in that plant, and realize those could almost have come directly out of a chapter in The Jungle. We can see that despite the success that the policy successes that came out of The Jungle, we're still living in a society where tens of thousands of people are sickened every year by the stuff that they eat, and some of that, I think, and Sinclair would wag a knowing finger at us, would be to say this is also the result of the lack of workplace protections, fair wages that those who are working in those plants can count on. That we're seeing the limitation of simply a regulatory environment if you don't have a workplace that is itself healthful and non-exploitative.
Has this book been appropriated in different forms and genres, different forms of media, so that people might be able to experience this story other than simply reading the book?
That's a really good question. And after working on this, I haven't actually looked across the, other media, but there is, I became aware of it only after doing the volume. There's a graphic novel by a German writer-artist, Christina Gehrman, which is called simply The Jungle. And it's, the novel of Upton Sinclair. It's about 380 pages, and it covers not all of the novel, but a good portion of it. I think it actually ends with the appearance of Sinclair interviewing Jurgis about his experiences, so giving us a sense of the novel as having produced the graphic novel. But you can see almost immediately when you think about it why a novel that is as graphic, to use one version of the term, as The Jungle is, might lend itself to the notion of a graphic novel.
I was going to say, I think Upton Sinclair's novel is graphic enough, but and did they ever make a movie out of this?
I don't know.
It seems like it would be a great horror movie. At least part of it would be horrific.
But it would, again, it would also run into, what we've talked about, the question of how do you do the ending of these political novels. And let me just, it's kind of off the topic a bit, but I think it's related to the question of how do you sort of convey the full effect of this work. The apparently, I won't just say apparently, I guess, concede to reality, the didacticism at the end of the novel is something that people have complained about in other great American novels. I mean, we mentioned Stowe, but Richard Wright's Native Son being another version of this, Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy being another version, where at the end you have court cases and you have what seem to be kind of endless speeches. And you have then the idea that American novels are trying to figure out how you get the politics in.
I'm also thinking about The Grapes of Wrath.
Yes.
How they Steinbeck literally would put an objective chapter interspersed with the narrative of the Jodes.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to go back, to the abolitionist fiction as well, you'd have moments where, the novelistic part of the narrative is sort of interrupted with documentation of the injustice that the novel is trying to address.
We've done an episode about the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And one of the points that Douglass was making in his narrative is that he had to actually understate and show slavery in the finest form, because the last thing he would want to do is be accused of exaggerating or any kind of a polemic. So he had to figure out how to do the most effective presentation of making an argument.
That is absolutely true about what Douglass says in the 1845 narrative. The other thing that might be useful to think about, to remark about Douglass in this context, is that Douglass goes on to sort of rewrite and extend his personal story in 1855, and then in 1881, and then updates that in 1892. And those latter narratives have not been as popular as the 1845 narrative, because the latter narratives have to involve even more direct argument and political discussion than the 1845 narrative, which in essence makes its point by staying very, very close to, even as understated as some of the incidents are, the direct plights that Douglass experienced as a slave, and then immediately after he escapes from slavery.
Does music factor into your consideration? Do you have a jungle playlist?
Not quite. Among the things that, it's a great question, right? Because among the things that Sinclair is at pains to do is to show the extent to which the burgeoning consumer economy, even among these highly exploited workers, is creating a new sense of reality. And he makes a nod here and there to the kinds of songs that were popular at that moment. So in the good old summertime, it's one of the songs that's mentioned here. And he notes that in relation to the rise of cheap fashion as a way that the young people are able to sort of establish themselves, in their sense of Americanization. So in many ways, what I would sort of cue up as a way of thinking about the moment of the jungle, and it's a way it actually, I think, works in a certain kind of mode of counterpoint, would be ragtime music, the ragtime music of that moment, Scott Joplin and the like, as the music of urban life among the working classes. This is a moment of the proliferation of sheet music as part of ragtime music. And I'm here in Chicago, and we have, as a very great local institution, the Newberry Library, which has extraordinary collections of American literature, culture, and as well as Native American extraordinary map collection. But among the things it has is an early collection of sheet music, ragtime sheet music. And ragtime sheet music is very attuned to the proliferation of ethnicities in American society at that moment. So you get, you don't even get simply ragtime as a sort of Black American form. You get like the Russian rag, you get the Polish rag, you get the Italian rag with the covers of the sheet music, sort of reflecting sort of stock images of these different ethnicities that were becoming more prominent on the American scene. So it would be ragtime as the soundtrack.
I also would put in a request for that Lithuanian fiddler at the wedding. I would want to hear a little Lithuanian wedding music just to liven things up even more.
Absolutely. I think you're right.
And Ken, you mentioned teaching a course on the Gilded Age, and I was really interested in one of your endnotes in your Norton Library volume that made a reference to naturalism. And can you say a little bit about this novel's qualification as a work of naturalism? Do you think it is part of that movement?
Yeah, with naturalism, we tend to think of people like Theodore Dreiser, whom I've already mentioned, certainly Frank Norris. There's an argument about whether someone like Stephen Crane is a naturalist, and moving forward, Richard Wright. And broadly speaking, what naturalism marks is the recognition, or you could say an argument that human hope, will, and desire is overdetermined by forces that are, extraordinarily extrahuman, whether it's our biology, whether it's, economic forces that no one has any control over and the like, so that family, individual strength, hope, and desire ultimately give way to these forces. And so one version of naturalism is very, very pessimistic. What it shows is that those who are unable to, or say unfortunate to find themselves within the, helpful currents of life, will simply be, ground to bits. It's a form that's often associated with the rise of social Darwinism at this moment, the idea of the survival of the fittest, and that those who don't survive are the weakest, and in some sense deserve whatever outcomes. And the other thing that often happens within novels that we associate with naturalism is that characters whom we see at the beginning become virtually unrecognizable by the end. They are so ground down and dehumanized that there seems to be almost no relation between the individuals we see at the outset and the individuals that they become later on.
Thinking about Darwinism, I'm mindful that you were just reading a passage about the individuation of pigs, and Jurgis is essentially like a beast of burden during much of this novel, where his refrain is, "I'll work harder."
Right.
And so the line between what is an animal and what is a person, I think, is blurred a lot in this novel. And I wonder if Sinclair is conscious about blending those two entities, the line between man and beast.
Very much so. Very much so. And as I indicated later on, when that passage, when Jurgis reflects on that earlier moment that I read from, he sees a kind of identification between him. He says, "Yes, I'm exactly that hog." But the one thing that I think that distinguishes what the jungle is from what I've described as one feature of many naturalist novels, and this is what makes the jungle distinctive, is that Sinclair sincerely believes that it is the capacity. It's within the capacity of human beings acting collectively, guided by the principles of socialism, that it becomes possible to redeem human life and human existence, making it something other than each individual trying on their own to triumph, making something other than that to become a tragedy of people simply being ground into the meat and the detritus of the meat packing industry. So this is meant to be, despite its the horrors that it chronicles, it's actually meant to be a story of human triumph, collective human triumph.
Kenneth Warren, thank you so much for joining us on the Norton Library podcast to discuss your edition of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Thanks so much, Ken.
Thanks, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
The Norton Library edition of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, edited by Kenneth W. Warren, is available now in paperback and ebook. Check out the links in the description to this episode for ordering options and more information about the Norton Library, including the full catalog of titles.